Snow fell in a thin, whispering veil over Loch, softening the edges of the village as the last hours of the year ebbed away. Hogmanay had drawn the scattered souls of the Highlands into one warm, noisy knot inside Morag MacLean's guest house, a squat stone building that hunched against the cold like an old sheepdog. By midnight, the guests were laughing, glasses clinking, the air thick with peat smoke and the promise of fresh beginnings. By dawn, one of them was gone. The trouble announced itself quietly. Morag came down early to set the kettle boiling and found the front door still bolted from the inside, just as she had secured it after seeing her guests to their rooms. Nothing seemed amiss until she reached the small sitting room at the back, reserved for late-night drams. There, slumped in a high-backed chair, sat Angus Calder, a visiting antiques dealer from Inverness, his glass untouched on the table beside him. His eyes stared, unblinking, at the frost-laced window. He looked as though he'd simply nodded off. Only the unnatural stillness gave him away. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no blood, no obvious wound. The chair hadn't moved an inch. The fire in the hearth had burned itself to ash hours ago. The room was locked too, the key still in the inside of the door, just where Angus himself must have turned it. When Morag screamed, it was less from fear than confusion. Word spread faster than smoke. By the time Constable Hamish Macbeth arrived, tugging his scarf tighter against the cold, the guest-house kitchen was full of anxious whispers and half-drunk cups of tea. Hamish listened, pale blue eyes alert, as Morag repeated the story again and again, each telling making it sound more impossible. A locked room, a dead man with no marks, and a house that no one had entered or left since the bells rang in the new year. Hamish went to see for himself. The sitting room smelled faintly of whisky and cold stone. Angus Calder sat exactly as described, his face oddly peaceful. Hamish checked for a pulse he knew he would not find, then crouched, careful not to disturb anything. The window was latched, the chimney narrow and blocked with a grate. The door key was warm from the room, not cold from the hall. Whoever had killed Angus, if indeed he had been killed at all, had left no path in or out. It was then Hamish noticed the one thing that did not fit. On the small table lay a sprig of rowan, its red berries shriveled but unmistakable. In the Highlands, rowan was a charm against bad luck, sometimes tucked into door-frames on Hogmanay for protection. But Morag swore there had been none in the room the night before. Angus had no reason to carry such a thing, and no one admitted to placing it there. The guests were gathered and questioned one by one. Each had heard Angus excuse himself early, complaining of a headache. Each had retired to a room upstairs, the floorboards quiet, the stairs uncreaked. No one had a reason to wish him harm, at least none they would admit to. Yet Hamish could feel it, that prickle at the back of his neck that told him the answer was close and stubbornly hidden. As the pale winter light crept across the snow outside, the village woke to a mystery that felt both too neat and too tangled. A man dead behind a locked door, a harmless-looking charm left like a calling card, and a Hogmanay guest who would never check out. Hamish asked the guests to remain where they were and stepped back into the sitting room alone, closing the door gently behind him. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence speak. Locked rooms often shouted their secrets if one listened long enough. The constable moved slowly, eyes skimming surfaces, lingering on nothing that would excite a less patient man. The chair legs rested squarely on the rug, leaving no fresh scratches. The whisky bottle on the sideboard was half full, its cork properly seated. Angus Calder had not been drinking heavily, despite the occasion. Hamish leaned closer to the sprig of rowan. It lay carefully placed, not tossed aside or dropped. Someone had wanted it seen. He sniffed it, then frowned. It carried a faint scent of paraffin, so slight it would have escaped anyone not raised among peat sheds and oil lamps. Rowan did not grow indoors in winter, and certainly not smelling of lamp oil. Outside the room, the local officers were already murmuring about natural causes, heart trouble perhaps, a sudden seizure. It would be a relief to everyone if that were true. Hamish was not convinced. Death, like people, left habits behind, and this one felt arranged. He returned to the kitchen and resumed his questions, this time watching hands instead of faces. When he mentioned the rowan, most guests shrugged or looked puzzled. But Miss Fiona Grant, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper cheekbones, froze just long enough for Hamish to notice. Her fingers tightened around her teacup, knuckles whitening before she forced a smile. "That's just a silly Highland superstition," she said quickly. "People still do that sort of thing, don't they?" "Some do," Hamish replied mildly. "Usually before midnight, mind. Not after." Miss Grant looked down into her tea as though the answer might be floating there. The guest house itself offered more quiet hints. Upstairs, Hamish walked the narrow corridor, noting which floorboards complained underfoot and which stayed obediently silent. One section near the stairs creaked like an old man rising from a pew. Another, just outside Angus Calder's room, did not. Anyone moving there in the night would have known the difference after a single step. In Angus's bedroom, everything was tidy, almost obsessively so. His suitcase lay open, clothes folded with care, no sign of a struggle, no signs of panic. But tucked inside a coat pocket was something that didn't belong, a small brass key, warm from the room and worn smooth with use. It did not fit the bedroom door. Hamish slipped it back where he found it, his mind already turning. Downstairs again, he watched as the doctor arrived and confirmed what everyone already knew. Time of death sometime after midnight, no obvious cause. Samples would be taken, tests run, but it would take days. Hamish suspected he would not need them. He lingered near the hall door as the guests spoke among themselves. Miss Grant avoided his eye. So did Ewan Ross, a broad-shouldered man whose cheer had evaporated with the discovery of the body. When Morag mentioned that Angus had asked earlier about the oil lamp in the sitting room, complaining it smoked, Ewan's face flickered with something like relief, then quickly hardened. Hamish returned once more to the locked room. He knelt by the hearth and examined the cold ashes. Beneath them, nearly hidden, lay a charred scrap of paper. He teased it free with a pencil, just enough to see a single word still legible despite the fire: midnight. A meeting, then, or a warning. The picture was still blurred, but shapes were beginning to form. Someone had been with Angus after the bells rang. Someone who knew how to move through the house unheard. Someone who understood old customs well enough to use them as camouflage. Hamish straightened, his expression thoughtful rather than grim. The room was no longer silent. It was humming, softly, with lies waiting to be coaxed into the open. Hamish gathered the guests in the sitting room once more, the same chairs that had held Angus now acting as witnesses to the new drama unfolding. Morag hovered at the doorway, her apron wrinkled, a thin line of worry creasing her forehead. The village constables stood stiffly behind her, notebooks in hand, looking helpless in the presence of the mystery that Hamish was beginning to unravel on instinct rather than procedure. He started with Miss Fiona Grant, who had reacted so strangely to the rowan. "Tell me again about the moment you last saw Mr. Calder," Hamish said, his voice quiet but precise. Fiona's eyes darted to the window, then back to the floor, and she swallowed hard. I saw him in the hall just before midnight," she began slowly. "He seemed a bit pale, tired maybe. He said he was going to sit by the fire for a while. That's all. I didn't see him after that." "Alone?" Hamish prompted, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she said firmly, though the words sounded brittle, like a thin branch about to snap. Next he spoke with Ewan Ross. Ewan's broad shoulders looked even more imposing under the harsh kitchen light, but there was a tension to him Hamish could not ignore. "I saw Angus at the door to the sitting room, fiddling with the lamp. He seemed worried about the smoke," Ewan said. "Then I went upstairs to bed. That's all I saw. Hamish noted the way Ewan's voice had hardened on. That's all I saw, as though it were a shield rather than a statement of fact. The other guests were questioned in turn, each offering small details, each insisting on truthfulness, yet each revealing subtle inconsistencies. One claimed to have heard the clock strike midnight while downstairs. Another insisted they had heard no bells at all. Voices rose and fell, overlapping, a chorus of confusion. Hamish listened for rhythm and hesitation, for the tiniest cracks in their carefully polished stories. He returned to Fiona Grant, pressing gently. "You mentioned seeing him just before he went to the sitting room. Did anyone else pass by?" Fiona shook her head, but her fingers trembled around the teacup. "No one, I think, unless someone went quietly. But I don't remember. I wasn't paying... I don't know." Hamish's gaze softened, but remained unyielding. "And the rowan?" Her eyes flicked toward the sprig on the table. I found it this morning," she said hurriedly. "I don't know how it got there. Maybe he had it. Maybe someone placed it," Hamish finished for her, letting the sentence hang in the air. The small contradictions were stacking up. Ewan's evasions, Fiona's hesitation, the minor confusions among the others. All threads in a tangled web. One detail nagged at Hamish, the warmth of the brass key and the faint smell of paraffin on the rowan. Someone had moved deliberately, using the house, the superstitions, even the guests' expectations as camouflage. Hamish turned to Morag, who had remained largely silent. "Did Angus mention anyone in particular who might be interested in his collection?" he asked. Morag wrung her hands. "No, not really. He liked to talk to everyone, though. But now you mention it, he did seem wary of Miss Grant. She asked a lot of questions about a piece he had just acquired from Skye." Fiona flinched at the accusation but said nothing, her lips pressed tight. Hamish caught the subtle exchange of glances between her and Ewan. There was more here than casual curiosity. He could feel the pulse of intention behind their eyes. By the time he dismissed the guests, the room felt thick with half-truths and careful silences. Hamish leaned back in the chair Angus had occupied and let the pieces fall slowly in his mind. Every witness had offered a thread, but only one thread would lead to the truth, and the cunning, he knew, was in noticing what people didn't say, in hearing the spaces between their words. The mystery had begun to breathe again, alive with deception, and Hamish was ready to listen to it carefully before the next move revealed itself. Hamish left the guests to their uneasy conversations and returned to the hearth, where the charred scrap of paper still whispered of midnight meetings and warnings. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the room's subtle rhythms guide him, the uneven tick of the grandfather clock, the faint draught under the door, the quiet shuffle of boots outside. Every motion, every hesitation, might be a clue if one watched closely enough. He began to review the suspects, tracing the threads of their lives back through the village, the Highlands, and the last few days of the year. Miss Fiona Grant, with her sudden tension at mention of the rowan, had been unusually interested in Angus Calder's collection, particularly a small bronze brooch he had recently acquired. The object itself was not valuable, yet she had lingered over it during introductions, asking questions that seemed harmless but were in Hamish's mind carefully measured. Was it curiosity, or was it calculation? Ewan Ross, broad-shouldered and quick to assert his innocence, had connections that Hamish had begun to untangle. His family ran a transport business, and Angus had once hinted that Ewan's firm had been careless in handling rare antiques. A quiet grievance simmered beneath the surface, easily masked by politeness and a cheery smile. Could frustration have escalated to opportunity under the cover of Hogmanay festivities? Other guests, too, offered shadows of motive. A visiting historian had envied Angus's reputation in the antiques world. Morag, though fond of her lodgers, had fretted over finances and the management of her small guest house. A guest who appeared timid might conceal ambition behind polite restraint, while the loudest laugh could mask bitterness. Every smile and every sigh could be a mask, every answer could hide an unspoken agenda. Hamish paced slowly through the sitting room, noting how each item in the space could be exploited or misread. The lamp, the half-finished whiskey, the chair, the ashes in the hearth. They were innocent objects, yet in the right hands even the most ordinary object became a tool, and the rowan, placed as carefully as a signature, suggested forethought, an understanding of local customs twisted into deception. He returned to the brass key, worn and warm, tucked into Angus's coat pocket. It did not fit the bedroom door, which meant someone had used it elsewhere, possibly to access a hidden compartment or a private stash. That action required planning. Whoever had done it was familiar with the house, with Angus's habits, and with the timing of the celebration. Whoever left the rowan had expected it to be noticed. Someone wanted the crime to be read like a message, not simply hidden. Hamish began cross-referencing times and statements. Miss Grant's last confirmed sighting of Angus, Ewan's retreat to bed, the historian's vague claim of hearing nothing. Every alibi had a shadow. Each contradiction, however small, became a point where suspicion could pivot. Greed, jealousy, and fear tangled together, forming an invisible web over the house. Even Morag, who appeared above reproach, had her own private concerns, mostly about appearances and livelihood, yet those concerns could be leveraged if someone had calculated the pressure points. Sitting back in Angus's chair, Hamish allowed the picture to clarify in his mind. There was no single motive that could explain everything. No one act was sufficient to account for the timing, the placement of objects, and the subtle manipulation of belief. Instead, it was the combination, the intersecting desires, the concealed grudges, the opportunistic timing, that created the perfect storm. Hamish's blue eyes scanned the room once more. He understood that solving this would not be a matter of pointing at one guilty party, but of untangling the lattice of intent that stretched across the guests. And in that lattice the faintest thread, the smallest misstep, would reveal the answer. He felt the tension in the house tighten like a drawn bow, waiting for the arrow of truth to fly. By mid-afternoon a breakthrough seemed to have arrived. One of the local officers, eager to prove himself, presented Hamish with a small folded note found tucked behind a floorboard in Angus's bedroom. It was a hastily scribbled list of names, with Ewan Ross's underlined twice. The handwriting matched Angus's own careful script. On the surface it appeared to be the motive spelled out: jealousy, rivalry, a grievance finally brought to a deadly conclusion. The constables were jubilant. "Well, that settles it," one declared, slapping Ewan's shoulder. Angus suspected him, no doubt about it. Case closed. Morag clutched her apron with relief, and the other guests murmured assent, comforted by the neatness of the solution. Ewan himself went pale, stammering denials, but the tide of certainty seemed too strong to resist. Hamish, however, remained quiet. He held the note in his hand, turning it slowly. Yes, Ewan had motive. Certainly there was opportunity, given the house and the timing. Yet the moment he glanced at the warm brass key, the rowan sprig, and the faint scent of paraffin still lingering in the sitting room, a cold sense of unease crept over him. The case felt too tidy, too simple. He asked the constables to show him how Ewan might have carried out the deed. They recreated the evening as described, moving chairs and stepping over floorboards in precise sequence. Everything seemed plausible at first glance. But Hamish noticed inconsistencies in the story. The movements described would have left faint scuff marks or displaced objects in ways that were not present. Certain floorboards would have creaked in places that had remained silent. The key, warm and out of place, remained unaccounted for. Even more troubling, Fiona Grant's earlier reactions kept gnawing at him. Her hesitation, her fear at the mention of the rowan, did not align with Ewan's supposed guilt, and the charred scrap of paper marked only with the word midnight had not been addressed. Who had left that? Why? Hamish let the constables take the lead for the moment, encouraging the villagers' belief that the case was solved. He listened to the assurances, the confident reports, the nodding heads, and he smiled faintly, though inside he was far from satisfied. Ewan might have provided a convenient suspect, but Hamish's instincts whispered that the real hand behind the crime was still hiding, watching, calculating. He retreated once more to the sitting room, crouching near the hearth to examine the ashes. The scrap of paper had been collected by the constables, but he could still see the faint smudge of something dark at its edge, ink or soot, he could not tell. Small traces, easily overlooked, small enough for a clever person to leave a trail that appeared accidental while hiding intention. Hamish rose, moving to the window. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling the village in white silence, perfect cover, perfect timing. If the real culprit had waited for the celebrations to mask their movements, now they could plan the next step without fear of detection. He returned to the table, his fingers brushing against the rowan once more. Its berries, shriveled and faintly oily, were like a fingerprint of someone who understood symbols as well as substance. Someone patient, someone who knew how to manipulate the expectations of the villagers. Hamish realized that declaring the case solved too soon was precisely what the guilty party had hoped for. The room felt charged now, heavy with anticipation. Hamish could almost hear the careful, measured breathing of a criminal somewhere nearby, waiting for the moment when attention had drifted, when the false victory had lulled everyone into a dangerous sense of closure. And Hamish knew with certainty that the truth, intricate and unyielding, had not yet revealed itself. Hamish sat quietly in the chair once occupied by Angus Calder, the soft tick of the grandfather clock marking the slow passage of time. He fingered the edge of the brass key again, turning it over in his mind. Something about it nagged at him, not its warmth, not its smoothness, but the faint engraving along its side that no one had noticed. Tiny letters, worn nearly smooth but readable under the right light. M.R.M.R., he whispered to himself. The initials stirred a memory, faint and tucked away like dust in a forgotten corner of his mind. A case from years ago, one the local constabulary had brushed off as petty fraud, a missing brooch, a visitor from Skye, and an accomplice who had vanished without explanation. Hamish had been only a young constable then, intrigued but powerless. He remembered the brooch, a small bronze trinket, almost identical to the one Angus had recently acquired. He stood and moved to the mantelpiece, scanning the guests' belongings again. Fiona Grant's coat lay draped over a chair, and a folded note peeked from its pocket. He unfolded it carefully. It was a receipt for a shipment of antiques, dated several months prior, addressed not to her, but to someone named Malcolm Ross. Malcolm Ross. The name matched Ewan's uncle, a dealer who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago. The connection was subtle, buried under polite introductions and holiday cheer, yet unmistakable. Hamish's mind traced the threads. Fiona had been curious about Angus's acquisitions, yes, but perhaps more than curiosity. Perhaps she had been investigating, following a trail that had gone cold years before, and Angus had inadvertently stumbled into it. Ewan's family, involved in transport and occasional handling of antiques, now appeared entangled in something older, something hidden behind polite smiles and festive chatter. He retraced the night in his mind, Angus inspecting the lamp, the rowan left as a sign, the warm key tucked into a pocket. Everything now suggested intention, but intention layered over history. This was not merely a Hogmanay quarrel or a sudden burst of jealousy. The crime had roots that extended backward, entwining the past and the present. Someone had planned this with knowledge of old grievances, old shipments, old betrayals. Hamish felt the tension shift in the room. The false victory claimed earlier had been comforting but superficial. The real complexity lay hidden in time itself. He looked again at the charred scrap of paper from the hearth. Midnight, it read. But perhaps midnight did not merely mark a time. It marked an anniversary, a cycle of revenge that had lain dormant until now. Someone had waited, carefully, for the right night to make the past intersect with the present. He considered Ewan and Fiona together. The connections were subtle: old family business, shared knowledge of antiques, overlapping paths through Skye and Inverness. Perhaps they were working independently, perhaps in collusion, but the lines now crossed in ways that explained inconsistencies in their stories and the careful placement of objects. Someone had studied Angus, studied the house, studied the guests, and had used every detail to manipulate perception. Hamish returned to the rowan, the brass key and the ashes. Each artifact now seemed a symbol, a coded message to those who knew its history. The old case, the vanished dealer, the disputed brooch, all had converged on this Hogmanay night. And in the shadows of the past, Hamish realized, lay the identity of a criminal who had patiently orchestrated events to appear coincidental, ordinary, even innocent. He straightened, eyes bright with quiet resolve. The pieces were falling into place, but the final move had yet to be made. Somewhere among the guests, someone waited, confident that the web of history would shield them. But Hamish had begun to see through the threads, tracing them back to the origin, to the root that had lain hidden for so long. And he knew that when the truth emerged, it would be both revelation and reckoning. Hamish returned to the sitting room once more, the guests now quietly uneasy in the face of his silent scrutiny. He didn't speak of the past or the vanished dealer, not yet. Instead, he pulled a small, seemingly innocuous object from his coat pocket. A silver thimble, smooth and polished, worn along one side. He placed it on the table, rolling it slowly toward Fiona Grant, letting it catch the dim daylight that seeped through the frost-laced windows. "Curious little thing, isn't it?" he said lightly. "Found it tucked behind a floorboard years ago in a cottage in Skye. Belonged to a dealer who vanished shortly afterward. Thought it might be of interest to someone who appreciates antiques." Fiona's hand twitched as the thimble stopped near her fingers. She smiled faintly, carefully measured, yet Hamish saw the quick narrowing of her eyes and the slight flush in her cheeks. Small things, but they revealed intent. "Is that so?" she said, voice calm but slightly higher than usual. I collect oddities myself. Didn't know anything about that particular thimble, of course." Hamish leaned forward, letting his voice drop to a conspiratorial murmur. "Of course. But some people have a memory for details, especially when they're connected to unfinished business. Do you ever find yourself thinking about things you'd rather leave behind?" Her gaze flicked to the floor. The practiced composure wavered for just a heartbeat, enough for Hamish to notice the slight tremor in her hands. She glanced at Ewan, then back at him, a fleeting shadow of recognition passing between them, almost invisible but impossible for a trained observer to miss. Hamish did not press directly, he let the silence fill the space. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people leave traces without knowing it. Objects, words, even gestures. A careful observer can read them, though, can't they?" Fiona's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the thimble, then drew back. Hamish leaned closer, nodding slightly, as if encouraging a confession through the smallest cues, rather than the loudest statements. She blinked rapidly, swallowing, and her voice came softer. I might have seen it once, years ago, in a place I shouldn't have been. But it wasn't relevant. I didn't—" Hamish let the words hang. He had no need to finish the sentence. Her reaction, the hesitation, the glance toward Ewan, revealed more than the truth she had tried to guard. She had been connected to the old dealer. She knew the thimble. And the past had not yet let go of her. Ewan shifted beside her, brow furrowed, watching Hamish with a mixture of concern and caution. He hadn't spoken, but the tension in his shoulders and the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Hamish didn't need to question him aloud. The way Ewan's gaze flicked repeatedly from the thimble to Fiona confirmed a silent alliance, or at least shared knowledge. The thimble, ordinary to anyone else, had become a mirror reflecting hidden guilt, unspoken alliances, and old grudges. Hamish's unconventional method, using suggestion, subtle psychological pressure, and the weight of history, had created a crack in the carefully constructed facade. He leaned back, satisfied, letting the moment linger. The guests were tense, alert, unsure of what had just occurred, yet unable to articulate it. Hamish, however, had seen exactly what he needed. The connection between Fiona, Ewan, and the shadows of the past had begun to bleed into the present. The investigation was no longer about the room, the rowan, or even the brass key alone. It was about the choices people made when history pressed on them, and the thimble had done what questions could not. It had forced a reaction, subtle but telling. Hamish knew now that the next step would bring the final pieces into alignment, but only if he moved with equal patience and care. The game was far from over, and the real truth waited, poised in the silence, ready to reveal itself. Hamish had barely settled into the quiet intensity of his thoughts when a commotion rose from the kitchen. The constables were shouting, boots clattering across the stone floor, and Morag came running, eyes wide. "It's gone!" she exclaimed, voice trembling. "The note, the one from the floorboard. It's disappeared!" Hamish's heart sank, but he masked it with calm. That scrap of paper, with its hastily scribbled names and underlined emphasis on Ewan Ross, had been the first tangible thread tying the present to the tangled past. And now it was gone, leaving only the faint echo of ink and the memory of its message. He moved quickly, surveying the room. Chairs had been nudged, cups rattled. The air smelled faintly of soot and whiskey, no different from before, yet he knew instinctively that the disappearance was deliberate. Someone had moved while the focus was elsewhere, quiet, patient, and careful. Fiona Grant was nearest him, her hands twisting in her lap. I didn't touch it," she said. But her voice carried an edge of strain, not fear, that Hamish noticed immediately. The subtle tension in her posture, the way her gaze darted toward Ewan, suggested awareness rather than innocence. Hamish glanced toward Ewan Ross. His jaw was tight, eyes alert, and he shifted slightly in the doorway, as if calculating how to maintain composure under scrutiny. No one else had been close enough to the note when it vanished, which narrowed the field considerably. Whoever had taken it had intended to disrupt the investigation, to erase a critical link between past and present. He signalled for everyone to remain calm and seated, then turned his attention to the surroundings. Floorboards, furniture, even the slight unevenness of the hearth, all were examined for clues. There was nothing obvious, no footprints, no misplaced object, no discarded scrap of paper. Whoever had acted knew exactly what to touch and what to leave untouched. Hamish's mind raced. The theft of the note was bold, but it also revealed a weakness, confidence, even arrogance. The culprit assumed the disappearance would confuse the investigation, that panic and distraction would replace careful thought. Hamish, however, thrived on these cracks. The more someone tried to erase evidence, the more they revealed about themselves. He turned again to the guests, watching for subtle reactions. Miss Grant's fingers trembled now, not from cold but from the effort of restraint. Ewan shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes flicking toward the door as if rehearsing a preemptive exit. Even Morag, concerned as she was, seemed to grasp the tension of something bigger than the moment. Hamish spoke softly, almost conversationally, as if letting the act of observation itself function as pressure. "Interesting, isn't it?" he said. "How some things vanish right when they are needed most. People sometimes think the truth can be hidden, erased, but it leaves a trace, always. Something missed. a detail overlooked. His gaze lingered on Fiona, letting the words settle. She did not reply, but the quickening of her breath and the almost imperceptible nod told him enough. Ewan, too, betrayed himself in the micro-expressions, a tightening of the lips, a blink held slightly too long. The vanishing note had disrupted the investigation, but it had also clarified one undeniable fact: the guilty party was watching, anticipating, manipulating. The criminal knew the importance of time, of perception, and had acted decisively to control the narrative. Hamish exhaled slowly, calm on the outside, though the stakes had risen sharply. The path forward would require sharper attention, swifter judgment, and an awareness that trust could no longer be taken for granted. The real danger was not just in the crime itself, but in the deliberate interference that now threatened to bury the truth entirely, and the guilty party remained close, patient, and dangerously confident in their control. Hamish had barely begun to piece together the implications of the missing note when a sharp scream tore through the guest-house, slicing the tense silence like a knife. Guests spilled from the kitchen and hallways, eyes wide with shock. Morag clutched her apron as she pointed toward the back corridor. "It's Mr. Calder's study," she cried. There's blood." Hamish moved faster than the constables, who were still scrambling to gather their composure. The study door, normally locked and now ajar, revealed chaos. A chair had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and the small brass key lay on the rug, but not in its previous pocket. Blood streaked the wooden floor, dark and fresh, and a figure was nowhere to be seen. Angus Calder's body had vanished. The room smelled faintly of oil and smoke, reminders of the sitting room and the rowan sprig, but now they were mixed with coppery fear. Hamish's mind raced. This was no longer a case of past grudges or stolen artifacts. This was a predator, in motion. Someone who refused to be cornered. Someone orchestrating events to stay always one step ahead. He turned to the guests. "Stay calm, all of you," he said firmly. "No one leaves this house until I know who is responsible. Keep together, but do not touch anything." His eyes swept the room, catching every reaction. Some guests paled, some stiffened, and a few whispered anxiously to each other. Yet Fiona and Ewan remained unnervingly still, their eyes betraying a flash of calculation rather than fear. Hamish crouched to examine the study more closely. There were no signs of forced entry. The door had likely been unlocked by someone with knowledge of the house, someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. The papers strewn across the floor were a deliberate distraction, masking the absence of the victim. And yet, in the corner, faint scuff marks led to the small window, a narrow opening, partially ajar, revealing a light dusting of snow on the sill. He followed the marks outside, boots crunching softly on the snow, and noted the trail fading into the white expanse beyond the back of the house. Whoever had taken Angus had acted swiftly and with precision, leaving only the faintest trace behind. It was audacious, and it proved one thing unequivocally: the villain was not only aware of Hamish's movements, but was manipulating events in real time, daring him to catch up. Hamish felt a surge of urgency. The stakes had escalated from investigation to prevention. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance was clever, dangerous, and now bold enough to strike again. He returned inside, eyes scanning every face, every gesture, every hint of unease. Subtle micro-expressions, the tense shift of shoulders, the almost imperceptible glance between Fiona and Ewan, they were all clues in this rapidly evolving puzzle. He addressed them quietly but firmly. "Someone here has knowledge of the past and the present. Someone is hiding more than they should. I will uncover the truth, but if anyone attempts to interfere again, it may cost more than a missing note or a missing man." The guests shivered at his tone. The room was thick with fear, suspicion, and the adrenaline of uncertainty. Hamish stood, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the faint marks near the fireplace. the subtle disturbance in the dust on the floorboards. The second act of the crime had changed everything. This was no longer simply about solving a locked room mystery or tracing old grudges. The criminal had proven they could act under pressure, that they were not constrained by the timeline, and that they would not hesitate to escalate. Hamish knew that he now faced a race, not only to uncover the culprit, but to prevent the next strike before it claimed another life. The game had turned deadly, and the rules had shifted. Hamish retreated to the sitting room once more. The guests clustered around, restless and anxious. The snow outside muffled the world beyond the house, leaving only the tense heartbeat of the moment within. He leaned against the mantelpiece, fingers brushing the smooth wood, letting his thoughts circle, probing for connections the chaos had obscured. The theft of the note, the disappearance of Angus, the subtle reactions of Fiona and Ewan. It all seemed overwhelming at first, a storm of misdirection. But as he examined the room again, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail he had overlooked before. A smudge of soot on the underside of the rowan sprig, faint but deliberate. It had not been part of the decoration, nor accidental. It was a trace left by someone handling fire or oil, someone accustomed to subtlety. Hamish's mind raced through every action of the night. The rowan had been noticed, the key had been moved, the papers scattered, and the thimble deployed, all acts designed to provoke reactions, to distract and mislead. But the soot, he realized, was a signature, linking the actions to someone who had moved between rooms, touching objects without disturbing the obvious, manipulating perceptions. The pattern began to emerge. Each clue left was intentional, each misstep crafted to guide attention away from the true sequence of events. He crouched near the hearth examining the ashes. Small depressions betrayed the removal of the charred scrap of paper. The edges had been lifted cleanly, leaving only the faintest trace of ink and ash. The person responsible had anticipated the investigation, anticipating which items would draw scrutiny and which would remain unnoticed. And yet, in their meticulousness, they had overlooked the soot on the rowan, subtle but telling. Hamish turned his gaze to the guests, his eyes sweeping over every twitch, every glance, every rigid posture. He realized the pattern extended beyond objects to behavior. Fiona's slight flinches, Ewan's repeated glances toward the door, Morag's attempts to steady the room. All were markers, consciously or unconsciously aligned with the movements of the real culprit. The interplay of actions and reactions had been choreographed, yet the choreography itself revealed the director. He spoke softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for the room to hear. Sometimes the truth is not in what people do openly, but in what they cannot fully conceal. His eyes rested on Fiona, then Ewan. Small things, overlooked at first glance, can tell the whole story. A touch, a mark, a gesture. And if one observes closely, the pattern becomes clear. A flicker passed across Fiona's eyes, almost imperceptible, but Hamish saw it. It was not fear but recognition that he had seen through the veil, that the careful web of deception was now beginning to unravel. Ewan's jaw tightened, a subtle confirmation of the connection. He allowed the moment to linger, letting the realization sink into the room. Every earlier misdirection, every seemingly coincidental act, the vanished note, the stolen scrap, the orchestrated reactions, was now coherent. The chaos was not random. It had been a deliberate sequence designed to mask a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Hamish straightened, a quiet determination settling over him. The pattern was clear, the web of connections understood, and the next steps would require precision, patience, and timing. The criminal had relied on distraction, on misdirection, and on subtle manipulation. But now, with the pattern illuminated, Hamish held the key to untangling the mystery, drawing the threads together toward the inevitable revelation. The pieces had fallen into place, and the next move would bring the hidden hand into the light. Hamish's mind raced as he considered the pattern he had uncovered. Every object, every gesture, every small deception now fit together like pieces of a puzzle, pointing towards someone who had acted not out of mere greed or petty rivalry, but from a far more intricate, deeply personal compulsion. He gathered the guests once more in the sitting room, letting the tension build like a coiled spring. The snow outside had thickened, muting the world beyond the guest house, leaving only the flickering firelight and the weight of expectation. He began deliberately, speaking softly, as though narrating a story that only the guilty could follow. This is not a crime of money, nor is it simple revenge for a perceived slight. The acts, the timing, the careful placement of objects, they all point to someone who needs control, who needs to orchestrate events with absolute precision. This is about more than inheritance or profit. It is about mastery over narrative itself, shaping reality so that others see what the perpetrator wants them to see. The room grew still, eyes darting nervously between one another. Hamish let the silence stretch before continuing. "Miss Grant, you and Ross. Your reactions, your hesitations, the connections you share with events long past, it is clear now. Angus Calder did not stumble into danger by accident. He was a witness to something that triggered a compulsive need to recreate, to correct, to dominate outcomes that had gone unresolved years ago." Fiona's hands tightened in her lap, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. Ewan shifted his weight, jaw set, eyes hard. Hamish did not need to accuse outright. The psychology of the crime spoke through the small, almost imperceptible cracks in their composure. He went on, his voice calm but incisive. The missing note, the stolen scrap of paper, the rowan sprig, the thimble. Each was part of a story you tried to write in real time. You needed to manipulate perception, to control what others believed, to erase traces that reminded you of a past failure. The crime was not only about eliminating a man who stumbled across that past, but about proving that you could execute a perfect sequence, flawless and unseen, bending reality to your will. Fiona's eyes flicked to Ewan, and for a brief moment the mask slipped. Hamish caught it, a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, and a tension released in a way that betrayed relief, not fear. He knew then that the collaboration, or complicity, was deeper than a shared opportunity. It was a shared obsession, to resolve the past, to assert control, to dominate a narrative that had long eluded them. He stepped closer, voice softening, yet gaining weight. This is why the act seemed so meticulously choreographed, why each small detail, key, sprig, thimble, paper, was designed to distract, to mislead, to guide attention, not for profit, not merely for revenge, but for the certainty of control, a compulsion almost artistic in nature, to demonstrate mastery over the outcome, to prove that you could manipulate events without detection, and that history could be rewritten to suit your desire. The room was silent save for the faint crackle of the fire. Hamish paused, letting the words settle, letting the weight of the psychology sink in. The crime had been more than an act. It was a statement, a carefully constructed assertion of dominance. And Angus had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness to something that could not be tolerated. Fiona's breath hitched, and Ewan's shoulders slumped, small signs of surrender, yet still holding on to composure. Hamish could see now that the motives were tangled, not in money or envy alone, but in a darker drive, a need to rewrite history, to assert control over people, events, and perception itself. That need had driven them to extremes, to murder, to misdirection, to audacious manipulations of time and observation. He looked around the room, meeting their eyes in turn, calm but unyielding. The truth was no longer hidden. The crime had been orchestrated not for gain or simple spite, but for the satisfaction of controlling reality itself, And now, finally, that hidden motive had been exposed in full. The stage was set for the final reckoning, and Hamish knew the next move would either end the deception or see it spiral further into darkness. Hamish had spent the better part of the evening drawing the threads together, letting the pieces of past and present, the actions and reactions, form a coherent tapestry. Fiona Grant and Ewan Ross sat across from him, subdued but not broken, the weight of their hidden motives exposed. The constables were cautiously satisfied, believing the case to be neatly concluded. Morag hovered near the hearth, wringing her hands, relief and apprehension mingling in her eyes. Yet Hamish did not relax. Something still gnawed at him, a subtle imbalance in the puzzle. He had observed the patterns, traced the motives, and exposed the psychological drive behind the crimes. But a quiet intuition whispered that one final move had yet to be revealed. He returned to the hearth, crouching to examine the ashes once more. The faint smudge of soot and the scattered remnants of the charred paper caught his eye again. Something about them now seemed deliberate in a way he had not considered. As he carefully picked through the ashes, a folded scrap of paper emerged, unnoticed in the fire's remnants. He unfolded it gently and froze. It was a note, written in Angus Calder's own hand, but it was not addressed to the guests. The words were simple, almost cryptic. The observer sees only what is placed before him. The real danger waits in plain sight. Hamish's mind raced. Every previous assumption, the alignment of motives, the subtle collaboration between Fiona and Ewan, the pattern of misdirection, was suddenly illuminated in a new light. He realized that while attention had been focused on the most obvious players, someone else had been guiding the entire sequence, orchestrating the chaos while remaining nearly invisible. The mastermind had been manipulating events from the periphery, waiting for everyone else to draw conclusions, to commit errors in focus and perception. He stood slowly, eyes sweeping the room. Morag's gaze flickered toward the door, but her posture held no guilt. Fiona and Ewan remained composed, yet a flicker of confusion passed across Fiona's face as Hamish's attention seemed to shift elsewhere. He moved deliberately toward the window, looking out over the snow-dusted yard and the faintly visible gate beyond. Then it clicked. The visitor, who had arrived quietly late in the evening, one whose presence had seemed innocuous, had been overlooked entirely. A distant cousin of Angus, introduced only in passing, polite, mild-mannered, with no apparent stake in the collection or the past grievances. Yet Hamish recalled subtle details, a faint smell of paraffin that matched the rowan sprig, a gloved hand that had brushed against the stolen note, and the soft, precise movements that had allowed Angus to be taken from the study undetected. Every misdirection, every psychological test Hamish had employed, had been accounted for by the person no one suspected. He turned back to the room, calm but certain. "The case," he said, voice measured, "has been influenced by more than Fiona and Ewan. They acted, yes, driven by their past and their need for control, but they were not the architects. The true orchestrator has been here the whole time, watching, guiding, ensuring that every move led to the conclusions I was supposed to see, not the reality of the situation." A silence fell, heavier than any snow-laden evening could produce. The guests shifted uneasily. Hamish's gaze fell on a figure seated quietly in the corner, pretending to study the fire, hands folded, expression mild. The mildness was a mask, one now stripped away by careful observation and deduction. Angus's final note was a warning, Hamish continued. It was not meant for me alone. It was meant for whoever would attempt to unravel the truth, to see only the threads they were allowed to follow. But the master hand, patient and calculating, left traces subtle enough to be ignored by all but the most attentive observer. That hand has guided us to this moment, and it is from that shadow that the final revelation will come. Fiona and Ewan exchanged glances, the realization dawning on them. Their carefully maintained dominance over the events, their control of perception, had been under the supervision of someone far more cunning, someone who had ensured that even the most brilliant deductions could be misdirected until the final moment. Hamish's mind, razor-sharp and precise, had identified the true mastermind. But now, as he prepared to confront them, he knew the ultimate test had arrived. The game was not yet finished, and the last-minute twist would challenge his genius as never before. Hamish stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the figure in the corner, whose calm demeanour had concealed the intricate web of manipulation. The firelight flickered across a face that, until now, had seemed harmless, even deferential. The faintest smirk betrayed recognition, the acknowledgement that the detective had uncovered the truth. "Enough," Hamish said, his voice low but firm. "The game is over." He gestured to the rowan sprigs still on the table, the brass key tucked beneath the hearth, and the charred remnants of the note that had guided the investigation. All the misdirections, the vanished scraps, the false leads, they were orchestrated. You calculated the actions of others, manipulated perceptions, and hid behind their motives. But you forgot one thing, that even the most careful deception leaves a trace. The figure's eyes flicked nervously to the window, then toward Fiona and Ewan. There had been a collaboration, yes, a chain of compulsion and old grudges, but they had been secondary players, instruments to be manipulated. Hamish's gaze swept across the room, noting their tense postures, the subtle micro-expressions that revealed surprise, relief, and the dawning understanding that they had been caught in someone else's current. "Consider the soot on the rowan," Hamish continued, moving closer to the table. A small detail, easy to overlook. It marked the path, tied together actions that seemed disconnected. The ashes, the partially burned paper, the thimble, they were all part of a sequence meant to mislead, to distract. And yet, in arranging these pieces, you inadvertently revealed your own rhythm, your own psychological fingerprint. The room was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Morag clutched her apron, wide-eyed, as the constables shifted uneasily, realizing that the real culprit had been outside their initial suspicions. Hamish's attention lingered on the faint impressions in the snow outside the window, the subtle disturbances in the dust along the floorboards. Each trace, almost imperceptible, had led him to the truth. The master manipulator had relied on predictability and distraction, but their overconfidence left the ultimate clue, the human tendency to leave a signature, no matter how well concealed. The figure, realizing the trap was complete, made a sudden move toward the door, a flash of desperation. Hamish's hand shot out, steady and precise, stopping the escape. "It is too late," he said quietly. "Justice cannot be avoided. The patterns, the clues, the inconsistencies, all of them pointed here. You thought the chaos would shield you, that the attention on others would divert me. But it only highlighted your errors." Fiona exhaled sharply, and Ewan slumped into his chair, relief mingling with guilt. The culmination of past grievances, present obsessions, and hidden compulsions had been brought into focus. Hamish turned to them briefly. "You were instruments driven by your own compulsions, yet the final orchestration was not yours. Recognize that your actions were transparent once the sequence was analyzed as a whole, and in that analysis the truth becomes undeniable." The constables moved to secure the culprit, and Hamish allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. Every overlooked detail, every tiny deviation from expected behavior had been read, understood, and connected. He had seen the pattern in plain sight, traced the threads of human psychology, and followed the sequence of deliberate actions that others had assumed would remain hidden. And yet, as the figure was led away, Hamish felt the faint chill of unease. The mastermind had been caught, yes, but the depths of their manipulation hinted at a mind that might strike again under different circumstances. Justice had been served in this case, yet the shadow of unfinished business lingered, a reminder that human cunning is patient, subtle, and never fully constrained. Hamish stepped to the window, looking out over the snow-laden village. He allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing that the threads of deception had been untangled tonight, but that vigilance would always be necessary. The clues had been subtle, the danger meticulous, but once again he had been one step ahead, and that alone had made all the difference. Hamish stepped outside into the crisp Hogmanay air, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The village was quiet now, the chaos of the evening having faded into the stillness of frost-laden rooftops and smoke curling from chimneys. He drew a deep breath, letting the cold sharpen his thoughts, the adrenaline of the night slowly ebbing away. Justice had been served, the culprit secured, the intricate web of motives unravelled, but as he walked toward the edge of the village his mind refused to settle entirely. He paused at the gate of the guest house, glancing back at the warm glow from the windows. Inside, guests were beginning to relax, murmuring among themselves, yet Hamish's eyes caught a subtle movement on the sill of the study window. A folded scrap of paper had escaped notice, tucked into the corner where the firelight barely reached. He bent slightly, brushing snow from its edge, and carefully unfolded it. It bore a single line, written in a hurried but deliberate hand. Not all endings are as they seem. Watch the frost for the first footprint of the next. Hamish's lips tightened into a faint knowing smile. It was a warning, cryptic and tantalizing, that someone, or something, was already thinking beyond the night's events. A lingering mystery, small but deliberate, hinted that the conclusion they had all celebrated was only part of a larger pattern. He studied the paper, noting the faint smudge of ink, the tilt of the letters, the subtle pressure points left by the writer's hand. Even in its simplicity, it bore the signature of calculation and forethought, a reminder that the mind capable of orchestrating such events was rarely satisfied with a single act. As he rose, Hamish's gaze swept across the snow-dusted village. Footprints crisscrossed the paths, some obvious, some nearly imperceptible, each a potential clue for the future. He felt the familiar stir of anticipation, the subtle thrill that came from knowing that mysteries were never fully concluded, that there would always be questions left unanswered, and that the next case could appear in the most unexpected of moments. The wind carried a faint whisper through the trees, and Hamish paused again, sensing a rhythm in the night that others might dismiss as mere chance. But he knew better. There were patterns in human behaviour, in intention, in error, that only a patient observer could detect, and those patterns often outlived a single night's events, stretching forward like shadows on fresh snow, waiting for the careful eye to notice. He tucked the note into his coat pocket, and with a final glance toward the glowing windows of the guest house, he set off down the lane, boots leaving crisp impressions behind him. The villagers' voices faded, replaced by the quiet hush of snowfall, but Hamish's mind remained alert, tracing the threads of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Even as the immediate danger had been contained, the subtle anomalies, the smudge of soot, the cryptic messages, the overlooked glances, reminded him that no mystery is ever truly finished. There was always one more question, one more hidden detail, one more shadow waiting to be illuminated, and Hamish, calm, methodical, unerring in his observation, would be there to see it unfold. The night stretched ahead, silent and expectant, and Hamish Macbeth walked on, leaving the village behind for now. The story of the last Hogmanay guest had reached a conclusion, but the whisper of unfinished business lingered in the cold air. Somewhere, in the quiet frost, the first footprint of the next mystery had already been made, and Hamish would follow it wherever it led.